Hi, this is Chapter 1 Supplemental PowerPoint. This is based upon the questions you had from the prep guides. There will be Chapter 1 and then also Chapter 2 following this for the summer class. Okay, what we're looking at in Chapter 1 is the foundations of human development and prenatal development. And I wanted to put some recorded things in here so that you would have something to listen to while you looked at the slideshow and hopefully make it more interesting and easier to understand. Be sure and download the PowerPoint before you start or the recordings will not work. And also you must click on the little speaker every time you open a new slide so that you can hear what I have to say. Let's get going. So here's a question that's interesting to talk about when we're talking about human development, and that is the differences in gender and how gender has affected our development. It's important to consider this because people really are different according to their gender. We have brain and hormonal differences. Obviously, women have estrogen and progesterone, men have testosterone as a more predominant hormone. We have brain differences. Did you know that women have a thicker corpus callosum than men and therefore find it easier to do things all across the brain at the same time and multitask, whereas men find it easier to concentrate on one thing at a time? There are lots of other differences, but that is one to keep in mind. We have evolutionary differences in needs between men and women. We have evolved to be different. Men have evolved to be more active, seek out more, I guess, violent kinds of things. And women have evolved to be more communicative and have more sympathetic and listening traits than men. We have differences in hardiness. As you read in your book, women tend to live longer than men. Women tend to bear illnesses more easily than men. For example, as it says on the slide, older males who are ill do not survive as well as older females who are ill. And finally, there are changing roles of men and women throughout history. We have had, just in my lifetime, huge changes. I was born in 1962 when largely women stayed home and they only worked as teachers or nurses or secretaries. And then only when they were single, when they got married, they would quit their jobs and stay at home with the kids. Things have changed so much since then. We are nearing equality, even though we're not there yet. And having lived through this era has been just such an interesting thing to do as a woman. So all of these things make a difference when studying development. You have to look at different cohorts, different ages, different age groups. For instance, baby boomers, women and men differences are different than the millennials, the differences between men and women in your generation, for those of you who are younger. Gosh, I didn't realize how much I said in my lecturing until I listened back to these. I'm so sorry about that. Okay, so nature and nurture. There's been a big debate about this through the history of psychology. Nature is genetics and biology and what you are born with. So what traits do you have that come naturally to you through genetics and biology? Nurture refers to how you are shaped by your environment. You're learning your upbringing and the way your environment um, shapes who you are. So for instance, think about things like your eye color. Is that nature or nurture? Well, it's nature. You're born with brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes, whatever color eyes you have. You're born with you're born with hair color. You're born with body size and shape. But nurture is how the environment can change things. Can where you grow up, where you live, what kind of family you're in affect your body shape? Of course it can. If you grow up in the United States, you are more likely to be obese than if you grow up in a tribe in Africa where people don't have enough food, for instance. That would be nurture. Nature has to do with things like genetics. Genetics include things like your IQ level. IQ level is 50% determined by genetics. So you are most likely to have an IQ level that's close to what your parents have. However, it also depends on nurture. So if your parents raised you in a very loving, caring environment that encouraged you to learn and try, and you feel good about yourself, your IQ is going to be up there where it's supposed to be. However, nurture can affect it in a negative way as well. If you grow up in a home where you are abused, neglected, nobody ever reads to you, you're not fed enough, and things like that, your IQ is not going to reach its potential. So nurture can really affect that. However, there is a range for where things fall. So I will talk about that on the next slide when I talk about adoption. Evolutionary psychologists study behaviors developed to support the survival of the species. What this means is that evolutionary psychologists look at behaviors that people have and then try to figure out, why would that behavior have been important for survival? Why did we end up with that behavior? For example, we don't eat blue foods in general. I mean, not pure blue, like navy blue foods. And the reason for that is that we are drawn away from them because historically those people who ate those navy blue colored berries and fruits died. Most of those are poisonous. If you think about the blue foods we eat, blueberries aren't really blue. They're more like a dark purplish black. And other blue things we eat are colored by food coloring, like blue candy, blue Jello, blue Kool-Aid. But they're not the most appetizing. The most appetizing colors are reds and oranges and browns, and those are the things that are good for us. So those people who ate the blue foods died or were poisoned and were not able to carry on their genetic code. Those people who avoided blue foods carried on the genetic code, and we have evolved to stay away from blue foods. So these are the kinds of things evolutionary psychologists study. They look at things like dating behavior, the differences between men's and women's brains, and how we have evolved to be different, all kinds of things like that. So it's really interesting. Why do women have a strong sense of smell during pregnancy? Well, because it helps us to detect things that are bad for us, that would be bad for the fetus. So if I smell something really bad, I can avoid it and it won't hurt the fetus. And so those people who avoid things that had very nasty smells during pregnancy because they had a strong sense of smell, the fetuses survived. So we have evolved to have that. For many of us, though, it makes us get really sick and a lot of morning sickness. When I was pregnant with my last child, somebody cooked bacon in the microwave and it made me so sick I had to leave the house for several hours until the smell went away. It was a very strong smell. Okay, newborn babies prefer to see faces over other patterns. What's the purpose of that? Well, we are hardwired, according to evolutionary psychologists, to look for faces. If newborn babies are looking at faces, looking for faces, they're looking for those people that will nurture them. If they are looking for patterns, they're not necessarily going to connect with the people with faces. Eye gaze is important to attachment. Looking at your caregiver is important for the caregiver to fall in love with the baby and take care of them. So those babies who looked at the faces over other things survived better. So that's evolutionary psychology. All right, hopefully you all remember this, how behaviorism explains learning. Operant conditioning has to do with behaviors being learned or unlearned through reinforcement and punishment. So I have an example up here. How did you learn to have good manners? If you have good manners, I'm making an assumption here. I learned because I had a stepfather who was from Scotland, and when he moved into our house, he was a wonderful person, but we had horrible manners. And you know, in Great Britain, often people are, or at least were in his generation, extremely polite. So he would hand me something, but unless I said thank you, he wouldn't actually let go of it. Or whenever I asked him for something when he was cooking us dinner, he'd, ask me, You know, what do I need to say? What do you say, dear? Right? Please, thank you, those kinds of things. And so those were reinforced by getting what I needed. And so now I'm very polite. I'm very polite at restaurants. I always say please and thank you to everyone I know because he taught me that. Um, when I didn't use good manners, I didn't get what I was asking for. So that was also part of operant conditioning. So behaviorism explains learning through classical and operant conditioning, and you should have had a whole section on that in your intro psych class. Assimilation and accommodation are traditionally difficult to get. It took me forever to get the difference between them. So I have found this wonderful and silly video that hopefully will help you get it. By the time you're done watching this video, you won't have any questions about what they mean. Basically, they come from Piaget's theory of learning and cognitive development. And Piaget says that we learn through creating schema or schemata in our brains. Basically, this is a way to organize the information we learn. So let's say you have a schema of a tree. If I say tree to you, an image comes to your mind of a tree. You have a schema for furniture. If I say furniture to you, you have a whole file of information on different kinds of furniture that come to your mind. So basically, these are like little file folders in your brain that help build your memory and language and learning about the world. So this really relates to vocabulary in some ways, but schema really means concepts. Oops, sorry, there's my clock going off. It'll be in the background, I'm sorry. So watch this short video about Little Rusty. This guy has a thick Texas accent, so it's kind of fun to listen to. But by the time you are done, you will understand the difference between assimilation and accommodation in Piagetian theory. Twin and adoption studies. Twin and adoption studies are used heavily to research development and what comes from nature and nurture. If you recall, nature is genetics, biology, and nurture is environment. So what people who do twin and adoption studies look at are the differences between identical twins raised apart and the differences between people who are adopted and their birth and natural parents. So they don't separate twins at birth. What they do is after the fact, they go and find twins who were separated at birth. So for instance, someone is giving birth to twins, puts them up for adoption. Two different families take each baby. So these have to be identical twins. So identical twins have the exact same genetics, right? So you expect them to have all the same biological features. But then they have different upbringing. They have different environment. So they're the same with nature, but different in nurture. So then you go back and you look at these identical twins after they become adults, and you find out what's still the same, what's different. And the Jim twins are a very famous study that was done, and they found that these guys both were named Jim. They both married wives who had the same name. They had similar pets who had the same name. One became a firefighter, one became a police officer. They had the same facial hair when they met finally as adults. All these kinds of really strange phenomenon. Now, some people say that when we look at the Jim twins, we're ignoring a lot of the differences, and that is true. People did sort of cherry pick those things to make it interesting. However, twin and adoption studies do tell you things like, for instance, both Jims are the same height. Both Jims have the same hair color. Maybe both Jims have equal intelligence. Both Jims have equal kinds of personalities. They're both outgoing or they're both very shy. And so that tells us how much of these personality and other traits are genetic versus how much are environmental. So let's say one is very outgoing and one is shy, and we look at many twins and we see that they're very different in those kinds of personality. That might tell us that extroversion and introversion is one of those things that is more affected by nurture or environment than it is by nature, genetics. Now, I don't know how much of that is true, but I do know that this is how we found out things like heritability of IQ is 50%, because we've looked at twins who've been separated, and you see that when you do a correlation, if you remember correlation, the association between two things, you see that about 50% of the time they have equal IQ. So this is what we do with twin studies. Adoption studies look at how are people who are adopted the same as their birth parents as they grow up, and how are they more like their adoptive parents. So I'm going to give you an example of that in the next slide. Here's an example of how the environment can modify the effects of genetics. So my son Seth is adopted from Guatemala. I usually use this example by starting out by saying, just as a guess, his parents are both probably about 4'10" in height. Guatemalan people evolved, here's one of these evolution things, evolved to be very short and stocky because they are mountain people, and it probably helped them to run around the mountains and climb and be very physical that way. And my son Seth is very physical. He's a soccer player, and he really has a low center of gravity, almost never falls down. When he does, he rolls over and gets back up. Okay, so he has the genetics of being very short, and he is very short compared to the US population. So let's say his parents were about 4'10". What Seth has inherited, as an example, is something called a range of reaction, which means genetically, his genetics, his genes tell him he could fall anywhere between 4'10" and 5'3". Okay, that's the genetics, 4'10" to 5'3". He's not going to be shorter than 4'10". He's never going to be taller than 5'3", no matter what he does. Okay, so if he had stayed in Guatemala and grown up, he probably would be 4'10". Since he moved here and grew up in the United States and lived with a relatively affluent family, us, he is 5'3". Why is that? What's the difference? Well, there are a couple things. One is our food, our water, everything we have here is fortified. Everything has vitamins. Even our water, you can drink vitamin water. But if you look at cereal boxes and everything that's packaged that you eat every day, all of our bread, all of our flour, everything is fortified. We get way more vitamins than we could ever need. In Guatemala, that's not necessarily true. He might have been raised not getting enough nutrients. The other thing is medical care. He has immunizations here he might not otherwise have gotten in Guatemala if he lived in a small rural village. We have illnesses that we can counter here with lots of antibiotics. But Guatemala is a war-torn country, and he might not have had access to all of those things. So being ill, not having enough nutrients, that all affects the height you end up with. So the environment Seth grew up in modified where he fell on the genetic range of reaction. Because he grew up in the United States, he's 5'3", which is still really short for here. But when he goes to Guatemala, which we have done, we've taken him down there to visit his home country and learn about it, he's taller than most of the people there. And he feels really great about that. So this is how the environment can modify the effects of genetics, and this is how we look at adoption studies as well. So Seth's IQ, Seth's achievement level, let's look at that. His adoptive parents are both teachers. He's studying to be a teacher. Is that something that came from the environment? I don't know. Maybe his birth parents were both teachers as well. Why does he get along with my husband, his father, so well? He has a similar personality to his. Is that environment or is that genetics? We'll never know, but you can really see some of his dad here in him and in his personality. It's really been interesting to watch. What are evocative forces? Well, the word evoke means to bring out. So your personality, your temperament brings out things in people. So I've had a very fussy child, and it's really, really difficult to deal with a child who has colic and is very fussy. And sometimes these children are the ones who end up getting shaken baby syndrome, or beaten because the parents cannot calm them down. So if you have a very fussy child, it might bring out anxiety in you because you're supposed to be able to calm your child and make them feel better. If you have a very easy child, a child with easy temperament, which we'll get into later, it may draw out or evoke really happy moods in the people who are caring for you. Okay, so fussy child, shy, may bring out harsher parenting. A child with disabilities may bring out more babying. So think about the child who cannot read, so their mother helps them with everything. They may grow to be very dependent on others instead of becoming independent. So you have a child who cannot read, who grows up to be an adult who cannot read, who maybe marries a spouse who helps read everything for them. They evoke that in their spouse. So how will the parental reactions affect the child's development? It's so interesting because there's this give and take. You have a child who's very fussy, therefore the parents may end up getting frustrated, may ignore them more, may potentially abuse them. And then how does that affect the child's development? It just makes it worse, right? So these are evocative forces, and we'll talk more about goodness of fit and how to sensitively parent as we get on into the next chapters. Active forces are different than evocative forces. Active forces refer to the fact that we are born with certain talents and interests genetically, and we actively select the environments we want to be in based on those. So let's take an example of Oren. Oren is a reader. He loves to read. He maybe has the genetics of being very intellectual. Both of his birth parents are very intellectual. And so he loves to read. He keeps reading and learning new things and getting better and better and better at it. He's not very coordinated, and so he doesn't go for sports things. So he never gets any better at them. But then we look at Bailey, maybe Oren's sister Bailey. She's very coordinated. She's born with this great center of gravity. She's got a great athletic type body that she just sort of was born with. And she chooses, because of that, to do lots of sports activities. She loves them. And so because of that, she ends up getting stronger and more coordinated all the time. On the other hand, she may not be a great reader. So you can see that the active forces, we select what we want to do based on our genetic interests and talents. So these may start out minor, but as you get older and select more and more and more of what it is you like to do and get better and better at it, the differences get bigger as you get older. So we grow into more of ourselves over time. Bidirectionality refers to the fact that all of these things we've been talking about influence each other. There's bidirectionality in parenting. I influence the baby. The way I care for the baby influences the baby. The baby influences me. Let me give you an example of this. My son Jacob has severe disabilities, and he is deaf and legally blind. He has a balance disorder. He was very ill when he was a baby, and we took great care of him, but because he's blind, he did not do eye gaze with us. It's really hard for people with blind children to overcome that, because eye gaze is such a big part of attachment. Jacob did not like to be held, probably because of his balance disorder. He probably felt weird unless he was in a stable, on the floor, on the ground, in a crib situation. So when he was very little, he did not like to be held. And when we held him, he'd cry. And we learned that if we put him down, he was happy. That influenced our interaction with him. So he would spend a lot of time alone, because when we interacted with him, when we picked him up, he would cry. And so he sort of reinforced that behavior in us. Now he's 27 years old. Today's his birthday, in fact. And this has changed a lot. And we do have a close attachment with him, and we understand each other well. But he influenced our behavior, and our behavior influenced whether or not he wanted to be out in the world more. This is bidirectionality. This bidirectionality that we spoke about in the last slide is very much related to Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. This is part of what we call a developmental systems perspective. We talk about how there are many layers of influence in any system of development for any person. So if you look at this little icon on the right, you'll see that the individual, the person, any person, but in this case we're talking about a child, they are the microsystem, okay? You yourself, you are a microsystem. The mesosystem refers to the things that directly influence you. These things have a direct influence on you. And for this example, we're looking at a child. They're directly influenced by their immediate family. They're directly influenced by the child care center or the school they go to and all the people they interact with there. and they're influenced by their neighborhood play area or any place else they go in their immediate environment. So this is the microsystem and the mesosystem. And the mesosystem and the microsystem interact and they influence each other. The individual is influenced by their immediate family, but they also influence their immediate family. Okay, so there's this bidirectionality there. The next system going out is called the exosystem. The exosystem influences the mesosystem and therefore indirectly has an effect on the individual. So for instance, the extended family, the grandparents, and how they are with the parents is going to affect the individual child. Friends and neighbors. How about the workplace? Your parents ever come home very, very, very stressed? Does that affect you as an individual? Community health services. Talk about things like if you have a religious background and you go to church, how does the church affect your immediate family? And then how does that affect your development? These kinds of things. At the same time, those things are affected by the mesosystem. So your parents affect the workplace. Your school affects the friends and neighbors. Your parents affect your extended family, okay? But developmentally for the child or the person in the center, we want to look at how these effects all center on and may change or alter their development. Finally, we have the macro system. The macro system is much larger than the rest, and it looks at things like the values and the laws and the country you live in and these kinds of things. So, for example, how does the macro system, before we had the Affordable Care Act, how would that have affected a child of poverty whose parents did not know how to access health care for them? That child might not have had prenatal care while in the womb. They might not have had vaccinations. They might not have had well child checkups, things like that. So the country you live in can affect the individual. There's one more system that's not shown on this, and this is called the chronosystem, and this is time. How does time affect all of these things as you grow up? So the developmental systems perspective or the ecological systems theory, which falls under that by Bronfenbrenner, basically is a theory that says everything affects everything else. There's so many layers of influence that you can't really figure out what is causing a certain thing to happen to any individual child because there's so many layers of influence.
Remember Albert Bandura and the Bobo doll experiment? He put children in a room with a lot of toys, and half of the children watched another adult beat up a big clown doll, one of those boppy dolls that you hit and it comes back up, it has sand at the bottom. And he found that those children who watched the violence with the Bobo doll emulated that. They copied that information and they also behaved that way toward the doll. And what he learned from this is that children learn not just by reinforcement and punishment or classical conditioning, but by observation. And this leads to all kinds of conclusions about, watching violent TV shows, playing violent video games, and how all of these things can affect young children's behavior. Well, Bandura also has a theory called self-efficacy. The self-efficacy theory looks at how you feel about yourself and whether you think you can be efficient at what you're trying to do. So, do you have self-efficacy in learning? Do you feel confident in how well you can learn? Do you feel like you know how to study? Do you feel like you know how to find the resources you need, how to connect with the teacher? That would be self-efficacy. I have a lot of self-efficacy in teaching. I feel good about my abilities. I feel like I'm efficient, I'm effective. I don't have a lot of self-efficacy in chemistry. I never studied chemistry. I wouldn't know the first thing about it. I don't feel very confident in my abilities to do that. I don't have a lot of self-efficacy in running a marathon. That would take a lot for me. And so if I can run down the block, I'm pretty happy. So self-efficacy gets at how you feel about your ability to do a certain task. What is attachment theory? Attachment theory is the idea that humans need to be attached to a caregiver emotionally in order to grow and thrive. It's really important, especially for humans, to be closely connected to a caregiver than it is for animals. And the reason for that is that animals often leave the nest or the den or whatever their place of living is before they're even a year old, sometimes in a matter of weeks. Think about the puppy you got at the shelter. It's 6 weeks old, right? And it leaves its mother. But for individual humans, humans take many, many years before they can leave the nest, quote unquote. And so they really need to be closely connected to a caregiver so they can get their needs met. It's really important for their survival, for them to make future connections. So if you're securely attached to someone as a young child, you're more likely to be able to securely attach to a partner later in life, and for living a normal life and getting along with others in society. Those people who don't have good attachment as children often grow up with things like reactive attachment disorder or other mental health difficulties. So it's really important for the baby, the caregiver, the child, and the parent to really be attached to one another, care about each other, feel close to one another. I hope you all remember Erikson's psychosocial stages from your intro psych class. And if you don't, I'm going to do a quick review here because these come up again and again throughout this class. This was in the developmental chapter, lifespan development chapter of your intro class. Erikson came up with these 8 stages of life that he felt that people had to go through and resolve in order to get to the next stage. Erikson was a student of Freud, so you can see that this is a pretty old theory, but it still holds pretty true today. Most psychologists would agree. He said that in the first year of life, the crisis that children have to resolve is trust versus mistrust. And so if a child resolves this well, and they're taken care of, and they get their needs met, and they're picked up when they cry, and they're fed when they're hungry, etc., they learn to have faith in the environment. And if they are not given consistent care, like some children who may be abused or neglected, they're going to have some problems and suspicion and fear. It's all about giving them that stable home environment. During the second year, children go through a stage called autonomy versus doubt, or sometimes called autonomy versus shame and doubt. And this is when 2-year-olds learn that they can do things for themselves and they don't have to rely on an adult. And they often ask to do things by themselves. So for instance, there's a video embedded on the left side of the slide that shows this little girl, maybe you've seen it on YouTube, trying to buckle herself into a car seat. And it's called Worry About Yourself, and it's really cute. But you can see that she is very adamant about doing this for herself and not only letting anyone help her. And if you allow 2-year-olds to actually give things a try for as long as they need to, then they won't have feelings of shame and self-doubt about themselves. If you are constantly babying them, doing everything for them, they won't like it, and you get a lot of tantrums, which is part of the terrible twos. But also, they won't feel a lot of confidence in what they can do. The 3rd through the 5th year, which is the preschool years, children go through what Erikson calls initiative versus guilt. And unfortunately, these are translated from, I believe, German or Swiss, so I'm not sure how easy they are to understand in terms of what they mean. But basically, during preschool, children learn to follow rules. They learn to sit down at the dinner table. They learn to sit in a circle and listen to a story. They learn not to pull each other's hair or bite or throw tantrums. And they learn how to basically do group activities. It's basically a school readiness stage. And in order to do this, they have to have the support. And if they aren't able to do it, they start to feel inadequate, according to Erikson. From 6-year-olds to puberty is when children are in elementary school and they go through something called industry versus inferiority. Basically, this is when children learn that they need to work to get things done. And all through elementary school, children learn to do homework, they learn to do the work in their classrooms, and they go through this stage where they learn that working hard is an important skill. If they're unable to do the work, for instance, maybe someone with a learning disability who can't read when everyone else is reading in the classroom, they start to feel inferior at understanding, and they get some of that learned helplessness you've learned about in the past. Then we have adolescence. During adolescence, which we'll talk about later in this semester, young people go through identity versus role confusion, or what says on this chart, just identity versus confusion. And this is when you're trying to figure out who you are. And if you think about all the little cliques and clubs and things in high school and where you fit in them when you were in high school, this can give you an idea of what this is like. Were you a band geek? Were you a what we called socials in my day, which are the really rich kids who were all football players and cheerleaders, those kinds of people? Or were you computer kind of person into anime and gaming? Or were you kind of a druggy type person? You see what I'm getting at? That people tend to fall into some of these areas. Sometimes some people never fall into any of them, but people tend to sort of separate themselves out into groups in high school. So this gets at, when you're an adolescent, where do you fit in, and figuring out where you fit in, who you are, what group you belong to, where you feel the most comfortable, who your friends are. Then we get into early adulthood, and during early adulthood, Erikson says we face a crisis of intimacy versus isolation. And this is basically, are you able to have an affectionate relationship with somebody, with a significant other or a partner? In Erikson's time, he probably would have said it's time to get married. Nowadays, marriage is really deinstitutionalized, and it's not necessary to get married to have an intimate relationship with someone. Can you make a commitment to others? Can you be someone's best friend? Can you love someone and give yourself to them? And if you are unable to meet that crisis, then you may not have relationships for the rest of your life. We get to middle age, which is generativity. And the actual term that's not on this chart is generativity versus stagnation, which is what you'll see in your textbook. And when you get to generativity in middle age, you're really all about making the world a better place. Are you someone who promotes things, helps children grow up, have children raise a family? Are you a teacher? Are you somebody who makes the world a better place? Are you somebody who has a concern for society? Do you generate things for society? When you die, are you going to be able to look back and say, I did this for the world, whether it's raising children or anything like that? Or are you stagnant, like a stagnant pond, not doing anything? Are you just sitting at home binging Netflix and playing video games and not doing anything to better yourself or the world? Then during the aging years, Erikson said we go through a stage called integrity versus despair. Sorry, that's my clock going off. That's the idea that you look back on your life when you're older, as I just said, and think, what did I do with my life? Do you say, gosh, I got a lot of wisdom in my life. I achieved a lot of things. I had a lot of children. I helped people with these things. And I used my life well. Or are you despairing? Do you look back and say, wow, I really wasted my life and it was the only life I had? So these are the 8 psychosocial stages of Erikson. And down at the bottom of the slide, after you watch the little girl with the seatbelt on the left of the slide, I'd like you to watch this YouTube video that highlights each of these stages with a clip from a movie. It's really interesting, and I think it helps with understanding.
Keep in mind as you review these components of an experiment that because of the way an experiment is set up in a very controlled manner, you actually can conclude cause and effect from an experiment. And this is especially true if you've done the experiment over and over and over again. It's been replicated many times. If you are actually controlling for every variable, as they say, except for the one that's manipulated, the independent variable, then you can actually say that one thing causes another in an experiment. You cannot do this with a correlation, as we will see in a few minutes. Why is random assignment not always possible in developmental research? Well, when you're doing experiments, for instance, on children and what makes them have better lives or worse lives, it's really difficult to randomly assign them to worse lives in an experiment. And so this is why we look at correlational research with these kinds of things a lot of the time. For instance, let's say we're doing an experiment on whether reading to your child makes a difference in their development. Does reading to your child increase their IQ? Does reading to your child increase their achievement in school, for instance? So we're going to find two groups of families and randomly assign them so that one group, the control group, never reads to their children, and the other group reads to their children on a daily basis. That just would not be ethical. You can't deprive a child of something that might enhance their development. So for this reason, you can't always randomly assign people to conditions when they just don't make sense for the children. This is a quick refresher of correlation. You know, you had all this stuff about scientific method, probably in many classes and in introductory psychology. I just want to make sure you remember the basic facts about correlation. Correlation shows a relationship between two variables. The number that's used for correlation is called a correlation coefficient, and it can range from negative 1.0 to positive 1.0. It never goes higher or lower than those. And as you get closer to negative 1 or positive 1, it shows a greater relationship. The closer you get to 0, the less of a relationship there is. So let's see if you remember this. As one thing goes up, the other goes up. That shows a positive relationship. For example, as people smoke more, lung cancer diagnoses also get higher. That's a positive correlational relationship. As smoking goes up, cancer goes up. You're going to get a positive number, okay? Something like 0.72 or something like that. Negative, as one goes up, the other goes down. Let's say we're looking at as you eat more, your physical fitness goes down. Okay, so as food goes up, physical fitness goes down. It's still a relationship. There's definitely a relationship going on there. There's a connection, but it's a negative relationship because they're not going the same direction. Another type of positive relationship is when both things go down at the same time. So let's say as you eat less, your weight goes down. Both of these factors are going down together. They are correlating. As one goes down, the other goes down. That's also a positive relationship. As long as they're both going the same direction, it's positive. And 0 is no relationship. So let's say as you drink coffee, it seems to have no relationship with whether you get cancer or not. So you may come up with a correlation of coefficient of 0.17 or negative 0.09. That really is a very, very small number and really shows no relationship statistically. So let's look at this a little more closely on the next slides. Does caffeine make people more alert? What's your experience of this? I know I have a cup of coffee every morning, and whether or not it's psychological or physical, it makes me more alert. Caffeine is a stimulant, and it is something that goes into your brain and stimulates your nervous system to work more efficiently. So it is intended to make you more alert and more efficient. Here's a correlation matrix. We're going to look at the bottom, looking across the bottom, the x-axis. We're going to say this is how many cups of coffee people drink per day. And when we look up across on the y-axis, we're going to say each one of these little marks indicates 3 hours of alertness. Okay? So you can pick any dot on here. Each dot represents an individual. You choose any dot and you see how much coffee they drank, and then look across at the y-axis and see in general how many hours they stayed awake. So I see somebody way over on the right who drank 5.5 cups of coffee. Let's say that's me. I drank 5.5 cups of coffee today. And when you go across to the y-axis, it looks like I stayed awake about 4.5 hours because each check mark is 3 hours. Okay. Pick another dot. I see the one on the far left. That person drank almost no coffee and they stayed awake 3 hours and 15 minutes. Okay. So if you look at all these dots, say this is everyone in our class, there is really very little relationship between caffeine and alertness or cups of coffee and alertness in this particular group of people. There are 3 ways that you know that. One is look at the correlation coefficient at the bottom, R equals 0.17. That's a low correlation coefficient. Remember, it's close to 0. It's way closer to 0 than it is to 1.0. Okay, so if it's close to 0, it shows very little relationship. Second, look at this scatter plot, this graph. The scatter plot shows a wide spread of scatter. It's kind of all over the place. There's not a real good pattern in there that you can see of any kind of line. So that shows kind of a weak relationship as well. And third, look at the line going through the scatter plot. This is a computer-generated line called a regression line. This line is almost flat. And so the flatter the line, the less of a relationship there is. It would be much more diagonal from one corner to the other if there was a relationship. Let's look at another one. Okay, if you look at the dots in this graph, you'll see that the one on the far right, say that's me, had 5.5 cups of coffee, and the marks on the left are going to equal 1 hour of alertness. So I had 5.5 cups of coffee, I was alert for 1 hour. Look at the person on the very top left of the top of the diagonal line. That person had almost no coffee and stayed awake all day. Okay, when you look at this correlation here, you see that it is a very strong correlation. How do you know this? Well, let's look at those 3 things again. Look at the correlation coefficient at the bottom. It's negative 0.94. That's really close to -1. So that is a strong correlation. If in science or psychological research we get a correlation in the 0.9 something, that is something to get really excited about. We found something strong there. Okay, so negative 0.94. However, it's a negative relationship. That means as one thing went up, the other went down. So the more coffee you drink, the less alert you are. It's still a relationship. The more coffee you drink, the less alert you are. There's still a relationship there. They co-relate. One goes up, the other goes down. But it's a negative relationship because they're going 2 different directions. You can tell this is a strong relationship also because look at the scatter of the dots. It's very narrow. It's very close to the line. And then thirdly, the line is very diagonal. If it's a negative relationship, it will go down from left to right. If it's a positive correlation, it will go up from left to right. Here's a perfect correlation. A perfect correlation, the line goes up from left to right, almost corner to corner. Every single dot falls on the line. These 2 variables are perfectly related to each other. Okay, this is something you don't find in psychological research typically. And often the only way to get a perfect correlation is to correlate 2 variables that are exactly the same. For instance, my shoe size is 7.5 across the x-axis, and across the y-axis, my shoe size is 7.5. Are they going to come to the same point? Of course they are. They're going to come to the same point. If you correlated all our shoe sizes with our own shoe sizes, you're going to get a perfect correlation because they're the same thing. So this correlation would have, look at the top of the slide, 1.00. And R is the letter we use to designate correlation, small r or large r. Some warnings about correlation. Correlation cannot determine cause and effect. It can only determine relationship. Okay, so the only way you can determine cause and effect is by doing a true experiment. Oh, here comes my clock again, sorry. The true experiment is when you have variables and you manipulate the variables, the independent and the dependent variables, and you set up the groups so they're exactly alike except for the independent variable, and you run a test and you look at the differences in groups. With correlation, you can't do that. Correlation is looked at after the fact. You can't say to someone, for instance, okay, I want half of this class to go out and smoke cigarettes for the next 20 years. Camel, no filters. And the other half of the class, don't smoke any cigarettes. We're going to set up a true experiment. And then all of you come back in 20 years and we'll see who has cancer and who's dead. Well, why can't we do that? It's completely unethical. You can't hurt human subjects. So the only way to look at things like cancer and smoking is to look at correlation, or you can also do animal experiments. But typically we use correlation to show the case for humans. So for many, many, many years, there have been lots of correlation studies done on smoking and cancer. And finally, there have been enough correlation studies to convince the government to require warnings on cigarette boxes. Those didn't come about till about 20 years ago. When I grew up, we had cigarette ads on TV, in magazines, they were on billboards. Now that's become illegal. Oh, I think they're still in magazines, but it's become illegal because we don't want to give children that idea that smoking is cool. So correlation can only determine relationship, not cause and effect. For example, look at this one over here. Caffeine and cancer has a correlation of 0.73. Let's say we did that in our class and we came out with that number. That's a really high number. But we know through many, many correlational studies about caffeine that caffeine really, as far as we know right now scientifically, has no detrimental effects on us, except for, making you edgy if you get too much. But in the long term, supposedly it's not supposed to be harmful. Why would we come up with this number of caffeine and cancer as a 0.73 relationship? Well, there might be a third factor in there. For instance, maybe those people who drink caffeine, which is a stimulant, are also smokers, which is another stimulant. So some people who are really craving stimulants are doing both caffeine and cancer. So maybe what we're really seeing in this correlation is a third variable. Maybe it's the smoking that's causing the cancer. But because we can't control all of the groups and do a true experiment, we don't know that for sure. So you can't always look at correlations and say, wow, that's really big. Keep this in mind when you're looking at science, when you're reading the news, looking at the media, seeing things on Facebook that say, this works, this causes that. Go in and dig a little deeper and see if it's a correlation, because a lot of times it is, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. Look at this one, a grade in this class and your shoe size has a 0.56 correlation. That's not real high, but it does show a little bit of a relationship. So does that mean everybody should go out and get bigger clown shoes so you can get an A in this class? No, this is called a spurious correlation. Spurious means meaningless. So we can find these correlations everywhere. You can find meaningless correlations. And if they don't make sense, then they probably are not real relationships. Sometimes these things just show up in the data. So what I've put here is a really fun website. Go here and look at the spurious correlations this guy has found. It's really funny to look at the kinds of things he's found. Look down, look at the correlation coefficients, look at the graphs of what he's made, and you'll see what I mean. The American Psychological Organization explains this on their website. And if you follow the following link and glance through and skim through the things they've written here, it will explain to you what I'm trying to get to. Basically, what I'm saying is that if you really understand the basics of how research works, then when you read research in the newspaper or on Facebook, you can look at it and decide critically whether that's really good research. Often when you see things on the internet, you'll see that they make claims that are not sound. So they may be citing a correlational study, but then the headline might say, chocolate causes cancer. We already know that correlation does not show causation, and we've talked about some of the reasons behind that. You can't say that something causes something else in a correlation. Therefore, as a good consumer of research, you could look at that headline, read and see it was a correlation and think, wow, there might be a third variable in the way they're in that correlation. I'm not going to believe this. So take a look at this website and see what you think about kinds of things they're talking about when they talk about being a good consumer of research.